Good morning, everyone. Today's lecture is on Aristotle's Poetics. This is the part 2 of the lecture. In the part first, we have discussed the introduction and important terms related to Aristotle's Poetics. Now, in this lecture, we are going to discuss chapter wise summary, and in lectures onwards this lecture we will be discussing chapter wise summary of the poetics. So let us begin with the summary of chapter 1st to 3rd of poetics. I have just tried to highlight important points of the chapters, and so that we can understand the zeal of the whole book. Aristotle proposes to approach poetry from a scientific viewpoint, examining the constituent parts of poetry and drawing conclusions from those observations. So, the chief aim of Aristotle is to reach poetry with a scientific viewpoint. Okay, like not just like that, with a scientific viewpoint, he wants to reach poetry and wants to examine the parts which constitute a poetry and wants to draw the conclusion from the observation which he has received during this study. First, he lists the different kinds of poetry, that is the epic poetry, the long poetry, long narrative based on some sublime theme, tragedy. We all know works having in common sense, in common language, we say tragedy is something which ends with a said end, but it is not tragedy according to Aristotle. We will be discussing the definition of Aristotelian tragedy later on. Comedy, dithyrambic poetry. Dithyrambs are the short lyric poetries, and most flute playing and lyre playing. Okay, flute playing and lyre playing were also part of poetry in those days. So he has lists these different kinds of poetry. Next, he remarks that all of these kinds of poetry are mimetic or imitative, but there are significant differences between them. So they are imitative, means they can be imitated, and they are imitation of something real, but there are differences in all kinds of poetry. So let us have a look at the differences. The first kind of distinction is the means they employ. What is the mean? What is the medium? What is the source which they employ in their in the poetry? Just as a painter employs paint and a sculptor employs stone, a painter uses paint, a sculptor uses stones, a poet employs language, rhythm and harmony, either singly or in combination. He may use language only, he may use rhythm only, he may use harmony only, or he may use all of them into particular combinations. For instance, flute playing and lyre playing employ rhythm and harmony, while dance employs only rhythm. In flute playing and lyre playing we have rhythm and harmony both, and in dance we follow the rhythm. So there is a difference. He also addresses the question of non-poetic language, arguing that poetry is essentially mimetic, whether it is in verse or in prose. It can be a prose poem, it can be a verse poem, but it should be an imitation of something, like we have already discussed in the introductory part of the chapter of the poetics, that poetry is something which imitates something from real life. The event or the incident may not have happened actually, but it should look real in itself, that it can happen to anyone. So thus he calls Homer a poet, while Empedocles, a philosopher who wrote in verse, is not a poet. So Homer is a poet because what he writes is poetry, is imitation of real life. He has been inspired from the real life incidents, but Empedocles, whatever he writes, they are not imitation. Like Empedocles is a Greek philosopher who wrote about the origin of. So Empedocles is a philosopher who wrote in verse. He wrote his ideas into verse form, but whatever he writes is not poetry, because Empedocles writes about the four elements. Okay, the fire, the earth, the air and the water, of which we are born, we all are made of. But this is, he has not imitated this from any real life incident. Hence, whether he writes in poetry or verse or not is not important, but the matter is important, and the matter is not an imitation, hence it is not a poetry. So Aristotle does not call him a poet. While Empedocles writes in verse, his writing is not mimetic, so it is not poetry. In tragedy, comedy, and other kinds of poetry, rhythm, language, and harmony all are used. In some cases, as in lyric poetry, all three are used together. In lyric poetry, we have rhythm, language, and harmony. While in other cases, as in comedy or tragedy, the different parts come into a play at different times. Okay, so into lyric poetry, we have all these combinations, but into tragedy and comedy, we do not have these things put all together, but they come one by one into the course of the whole drama. Then he says the second distinction is the objects that are imitated. All poetry represents actions with agents who are either better than us, worse than us, or quite like us. So the second distinction, that second difference is what objects are imitated. What do we take for our imitation? What are the objects of our imitation? What are the persons of who are based, who are in the background of our imitations? So he says all poetry represents action with agents. Agents are the figures that that are walking out before our eyes into the course of the poetry, into the course of a drama, into the course of a tragedy, into the course of a comedy. They are either better than us or worse than us or quite like us. So there are three qualities. They can be equal to the audience, they can be better to the audience, they can be worse to the audience. For instance, tragedy and epic poetry deal with characters who are better than us. So he classifies the characters, the poems having different kind of characters. He says tragedy and epic poetry deal with characters who are better than us. In tragedy, we have figures who are better than us, like when we talk about Oedipus or when we talk about Sophocles, and or we talk about Euripides. They all use characters from, although we are known to those characters, okay, they are known to us, they are very renowned characters, but they are better to us, like some king, like some Moor, like some very historical figure. For example, Shakespeare uses Othello as a Moor who is better than the common people who were witnessing the tragedy, or who were who have become who were the audience of the drama. Then we have the example of Oedipus Rex. Oedipus was a king again, so he was better than the public, definitely. And so there are many examples in tragedies where characters are better than us, or in epic poetries like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, or like in Mahabharata and Ramayana and in India. So these are all epic poetries, and the characters are far much better than us. They are gods. Okay, they are gods. They are not common human beings. So in tragedy and epic poetry, the characters are better than the real life, while in comedy and parody, the dramatist or the poet deal with characters who are worse than us, because they wants to create ridicule, they wants to create laughter, and laughter is something which is created when you can laugh on something. You cannot laugh on gods, on the actions of God. You cannot laugh on the actions of historical figures, historical heroes. Rather, we can laugh on people having in comedy, the characters are people who are worse than us, so that we can laugh on them, we can make fun of them, because this is the object of comedy, to make people laugh. Okay, so in tragedy, so there are distinction between the objects that are being imitated, and in lyric poetry the characters can be like us. Okay, we can deal with the common people also in lyric poetry. So in tragedy we deal with characters who are better than us. In epic poetry we deal, not we, but the dramatists, but the writers, but the poets, the authors, they deal with characters who are better than us. In epic poetry they again deal with characters who are better than, because you know what happens, tragedy and epic poetry, they are constituent of supernatural activities, miracles. There are so many things, and they cannot happen without we having they cannot happen without we having something extraordinary into ourselves. We cannot believe. The tragedy should be believable, should be people can should believe on it, and we cannot believe something until it is better than us. Okay, so this is what he says is the difference, distinction between the characters or the objects that are being imitated. Now the final distinction, which is the zeal of the first three chapters. We are discussing the you know best contents of each chapters, the zeal of each chapters. So the final distinction is with the manner of representation, how they are being represented. The poet either speaks directly in narrative or assumes the characters of people in the narrative and speaks through them. Okay, how the poet represents his character, he can speak directly in a direct narrative in a first person, or can assume the character of people speaking, like in the third person narrative, in the second person narrative. For instance, many poets tell straight narratives, while Homer alternates between narrative and accounts of speeches given by characters in his narrative. Many people, they use first person in telling the stories in the narratives, while Homer, he differentiates between narrative and accounts of speeches given by the characters in the narrative. Okay, Homer has used this different types. In tragedy and comedy, the poet speaks exclusively through assumed characters. And when we talk about tragedy and comedy, which are actually dramatic, not narrative, the poet speaks through the characters. So the characters are mouthpiece of the poet. Okay, they are mouthpiece of the poet, and the poet talks through the characters. Like in the dialogue form, in Shakespearean dramas we have dialogues. Okay, in Foster's drama we have dialogues. So these are all the traits and distinctions between the various kinds of poetries, which we are going to discuss throughout the discussion on poetics in the coming episodes, in the coming lectures. So there are, in brief, let us just have a quick look on over the descriptions which are given in the first three chapters. The poet says that there have been many various kinds of poetry, that can be epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, dithyramb, flute playing, lyre playing, etc., and all should be mimetic or imitative, and there are differences in all kind of poetries. The differences are distinctions are in the means of the poetry, um in the means of the poetry, and in the agents or objects of the poetries, and in the manner of representation. So these are the distinctions or differences which he mentions in the first three chapters. So in the coming lectures we are going to discuss or summarize, we will try to summarize more traits or more qualities of coming chapters. So that's all. You can ask your questions into the comment box, or you can directly message me into my WhatsApp number. Thank you so much for watching.